And this is something that literally anyone can do these days by converting an audio file to a MIDI file using an online converter like this one. A MIDI file can really only record chromatic pitches, so the notes corresponding to piano. So if you take an audio file with all of its complex overtones and sound nuances, and then you convert it to MIDI, we essentially simplify or summarize that spectrum to the closest semitones. We're forcing that complex sound spectrum onto the chromatic system. And we end up with a chromatic pixelation. And this also kind of works for music. Now, over the past few years, there's been a couple of viral videos on talking pianos, the most famous being a video by Mark Rober. But this concept has been around for ages. One of the first people to play around with this idea was the Austrian composer Peter Ablinger in the late 1990s, who, with the help of the composer-developer Winfried Ritsch, created a device capable of playing a regular acoustic piano for this form of audio pixelation. This is from a work titled A Letter from Schoenberg, in which an original recording of Schoenberg was passed through this chromatic pixelation process.
I can tell you, you will regret this severely. I will be busy to help you to do.
Now, the reason you need a machine for this task, apart from the fact that you need to press so many notes, is because the rhythms and the dynamics have to be played very precisely if you want to imitate the sound colors and characteristics of the voice. Now, obviously, there are many other ways that you can pixelate or distort audio. We all know about auto-tuning. There's also something called bit crushing, which is fascinating. I'll leave a link in the description. But there is another way of imposing chromatic pixelation on the voice, and that is psychologically.
From Chicago to New York. From Chicago to New York. From Chicago. From Chicago to New York. From Chicago. One of the fastest trains. One of the fastest trains. One of the fastest trains. One of the fastest train, fastest train. One of the fastest train, fastest.
This is one of the best-known early examples of this technique by the composer Steve Reich. The work contrasts American train travel in the 1940s with the Holocaust trains in Europe. Reich took recordings of people talking about trains and paired them with musical material in such a way that forces our ears to hear the speech as something melodic.
Flames going up in the sky. Flames going up in the sky. It was smoking. It was smoking going up in the sky. Flames going up to the sky. It was smoking, it was smoking.
However, an even earlier example of this technique can be found in the work John Somebody by the composer Scott Johnson, who unfortunately passed away just earlier this year.
You know who's in New York? Remember that guy, John somebody? He was sort of a, remember that guy, John somebody? He was sort of a, John somebody? You know who's in New York? He was sort of a, remember that guy? He was sort of a, he was John somebody? You know who's in New York? He was a, remember that guy? He was a, John somebody? You know who's in New York? Remember that guy, John somebody? He was sort of a, he was sort of a, he was sort of a, he was sort of a,
When I started doing, John Somebody and this kind of stuff, I studied art, visual art, and I remember that feeling at that time that in the visual arts, this was in the conceptual art era, late 70s, that there was more inventiveness and more surprise than in the music world. And one of the things I wanted to do when I settled on being a composer was to have some of that what I used to call it the gee whiz factor, the sort of delight in something new.
Now, if you get the chance, I highly recommend having a bit of a listen to this album. It's pretty crazy, but it's extraordinarily interesting and very musical. In the late 90s, Peter Ablinger, who we mentioned before, also began to play around with this technique, but in a slightly more extreme way.
When Hitler invaded Norway and Denmark, and I had to leave Sweden, and I went to Finland.
我为代表中华人民共和国第一届全国人民代表会议大会第一次会议。
4 steps in my pilgrimage. Of them, the first occurred in Paris during the armistice after the 1914 war.
The voices are recordings of historically significant personalities, and similar to with the other works we just looked at, the accompaniment is used to accentuate the musical qualities in the voice, things like the articulation, the phrasing, and the pitch.
I'm a communist because I believe that black people, with whose labor and blood this country was built, have a right to a great deal of the wealth that has been hoarded in the hands of the Hughes, the Rockefellers, the Kennedys, the DuPonts, all the super powerful white capitalists of America. Further, I'm a communist because I believe that black men should not be coerced into fighting a racist imperialist war in Southeast Asia.
When we give spoken words, which are free from any tuning system, this sort of musical context, we're forcing the listener to hear them as part of the chromatic tuning system, as distinct pitches. It's almost the opposite of the technique we were looking at before. So instead of creating text using a musical instrument, we're taking regular text and we're making it into something musical. If you're a nerd for this sort of stuff, I highly recommend going online and checking out some audio to MIDI converters, because once you have an audio file converted to MIDI, you can do whatever you want with it. You can open it with almost any audio editing software, even notation software, and you can give that MIDI file